"Sir, I told you, this seat isn't for economy passengers." The sharp voice cut through the chatter in the airplane cabin, making a few heads turn. Mr. James Whittaker, an elderly man in his late 70s, dressed in a well-worn brown suit, looked up from his seat with a confused expression. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his old leather briefcase, the one that had traveled the world with him. I think there's been a mistake," he said softly. "My ticket says 2A." The young flight attendant, Tiffany Reynolds, rolled her eyes, placing a manicured hand on her hip. "Sir, I don't know how you got this ticket, but first class is reserved for our premium passengers." She gave a forced smile. "And no offense, but you don't look like you belong here." A few gasps could be heard from nearby passengers. A businessman in a crisp navy suit frowned at the scene, while a woman across the aisle whispered to her husband. James swallowed hard. He wasn't looking for trouble. He simply wanted to settle into his seat and enjoy the journey. "I assure you," he said, pulling out his boarding pass with slightly shaky fingers, "this is my assigned seat." Tiffany barely glanced at the ticket before sighing dramatically. "Look, sir, I don't have time for this. You must have switched tickets with someone. I'm going to have to ask you to move back to economy." Before James could respond, another flight attendant, an older woman named Karen, approached. "What's going on here?" she asked, glancing between them. "This gentleman is trying to sit in first class without a proper ticket," Tiffany huffed. Karen took the boarding pass from James's hand, reading it carefully. Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked at him with a flicker of recognition. "This is a valid first-class ticket," she said slowly. Then, turning to Tiffany, she added, "He belongs here." Tiffany's expression faltered for a second before she quickly masked it with an annoyed smile. "Oh, well, I suppose that's settled then." She turned to James. "Enjoy your seat, sir." Her tone dripped with insincerity, and James could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. But what no one on that plane knew, not even the rude flight attendant, was that James Whittaker wasn't just another old man. And soon, she would regret every word. As James settled into his seat, adjusting his worn suit jacket, he could feel the weight of judgment lingering in the air. The flight attendant, Tiffany, huffed as she walked away, clearly annoyed. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman leaned in slightly. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a hushed voice. "Are you the James Whittaker?" James offered a small, polite smile. "That depends." "Which one are you thinking of?" The man's eyes widened. "The James Whittaker who built Whittaker Aerospace? The man responsible for half the aviation technology we use today?" A few heads turned at the name. A young woman sitting a few seats away gasped softly, whispering to her husband. James chuckled. "Guilty as charged." The businessman's face turned pale. "Oh my God. My company uses your technology every day. You're practically a legend in the industry." The murmurs around the first-class cabin grew louder. Passengers whispered, some sneaking glances at James, suddenly realizing he was no ordinary traveler. Tiffany, still standing near the galley, noticed the shift in energy. She frowned and walked briskly back toward the front, sensing that something was happening. Karen, the senior flight attendant, had been watching the whole interaction. She leaned down next to James and whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry for what happened earlier." James simply smiled. "No harm done." "But I do wonder, how often do you treat people like me that way?" Karen swallowed, glancing over at Tiffany, who was now nervously checking her nails. "Not everyone understands that respect isn't about appearances," she said softly. James nodded thoughtfully. "That's something worth teaching, don't you think?" Tiffany, oblivious to what was unfolding, returned with a forced, professional smile. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked, her tone now sugar-coated. James met her gaze, his blue eyes twinkling with something unreadable. Water will be fine. Thank you. But Tiffany had no idea that her rude behavior would soon cost her more than just embarrassment. If you're enjoying this story and want more captivating tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to Storytelling Sphere. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming. Now let's dive back into the story. Tiffany placed the glass of water on James's tray table with an exaggerated politeness, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the tension shifting in the cabin, but she still didn't grasp why. The businessman who had recognized James pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. Moments later, he turned it toward her. "You might want to see this," he said, his voice laced with amusement. Tiffany frowned and hesitated before looking. The screen displayed a news article with a bold headline, "James Whittaker, the billionaire who revolutionized aviation." Her stomach twisted. The article detailed how James Whittaker, a once humble engineer, had developed cutting-edge aircraft technology, securing contracts with the world's leading airlines, including the very airline she worked for. Tiffany's hands trembled as she scrolled through the page. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. She had just insulted and mistreated one of the most influential figures in the airline industry. Passengers murmured louder, the news traveling through the cabin like wildfire. The elderly woman sitting a row ahead gave Tiffany a disappointed glance, while another man shook his head in disapproval. Karen, the senior flight attendant, leaned in with a forced smile. "Tiffany, can I see you in the galley for a moment?" Tiffany swallowed hard and followed Karen to the small workspace near the front of the plane. The second they were out of passengers' earshot, Karen's expression turned icy. "What were you thinking?" she hissed. I didn't know who he was," Tiffany stammered, panic creeping into her voice. Karen crossed her arms. "That's the problem. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Tiffany's heart pounded in her chest. "I can fix this," she muttered. Karen sighed, shaking her head. "You better hope so, because if he files a complaint, your career is over." Meanwhile, James remained in his seat, calm and unbothered, watching everything unfold. He had seen this kind of behavior before, people who judged based on appearance rather than character. But what Tiffany didn't realize yet was that James wasn't the type to take petty revenge. No, he had a much bigger lesson in mind. Tiffany's pulse raced as she walked back down the aisle, forcing a nervous smile onto her face. The weight of every passenger's gaze pressed down on her, their silent judgment like daggers to her already sinking confidence. She stopped next to James, her voice trembling. "Mr. Whittaker, I sincerely apologize for how I treated you earlier. It was unprofessional and completely unacceptable." James lifted his eyes to her, his expression unreadable. "Unacceptable," he repeated slowly, tapping a thoughtful finger against the armrest. "Is that how you'd describe it?" Tiffany's throat tightened. I didn't mean any harm, I just—" "You assumed I was a burden," James cut in, his tone sharp but composed. "You judged me based on nothing more than my appearance. Tell me, do you treat all elderly passengers this way? Or was I a special case?" Her face burned with shame. She fumbled for an excuse but found none. James let out a slow exhale and leaned back. "It's easy to say you're sorry now that you know who I am. But do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Tiffany opened her mouth but hesitated. Did she really understand? Before she could answer, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on board. Please join us in recognizing James Whittaker, the man whose innovations have made modern air travel what it is today." A wave of applause rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned toward James with admiration, some even standing to get a better look. Tiffany felt like she was shrinking. The businessman next to James smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "You've done a lot for this industry, sir. It's an honor to be on the same flight as you." James chuckled lightly. "I'm just an old man who had a few ideas." The businessman shook his head. "No, sir, you're a legend." Tiffany wanted to disappear. James finally turned back to her, his gaze piercing. "So tell me, Miss Tiffany, right?" She nodded weakly. "If I were just another old man, if I weren't James Whittaker, would you have apologized?" Tiffany's stomach twisted into knots. She didn't have an answer. James studied her for a long moment before nodding to himself. "I think you have a lesson to learn, and I'm going to make sure you learn it." Tiffany's heart dropped. "What? What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. James smiled, but there was something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. "You'll see." Tiffany spent the rest of the flight on edge, stealing glances at James whenever she passed by his seat. He was calm, composed, almost amused, but his words haunted her. "I'm going to make sure you learn it." What did that mean? As the plane began its descent, the tension in Tiffany's chest only grew. She braced herself, hoping James would simply let the situation go. But as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, James calmly stood up and walked toward the exit. He didn't rush, and passengers around him parted with a respectful nod. Tiffany exhaled in relief, thinking she had avoided any further embarrassment, until her supervisor approached. "Tiffany," she turned, stiffening at the serious expression on her superior's face. "We need to talk, now." Passengers disembarked as Tiffany followed her supervisor into the flight crew's private lounge at the airport. The moment the door shut, her supervisor crossed her arms. "Do you have any idea who Mr. Whittaker is?" she asked, voice tight with frustration. Tiffany swallowed hard. I do now." Her supervisor pinched the bridge of her nose. "James Whittaker is not just a passenger. He's one of the most influential figures in aviation history. He's responsible for policies that protect passengers and flight staff alike. He's also a major shareholder in this airline." Tiffany felt like she'd been punched in the gut. "He's what?" Her supervisor nodded. "And do you want to guess who just sent a formal complaint about your behavior?" Tiffany's stomach churned. "Please, I was having a bad day. I didn't mean—" Her supervisor held up a hand. "Save it. Mr. Whittaker didn't ask for you to be fired, but he did request that you undergo a special training program." Tiffany blinked. Training program?" Her supervisor smirked. "Oh, you'll see." 2 days later, Tiffany arrived at the airline's headquarters, expecting a dull classroom session about customer service. Instead, she was handed a set of senior citizen mobility aids, a pair of weighted ankle straps, a vision-restricting pair of glasses, noise-dampening earplugs, and an uncomfortably stiff back brace. Her supervisor gestured for her to put them on. "Welcome to your lesson in empathy." For the next 8 hours, Tiffany was put through a rigorous simulation, walking through crowded terminals with a weighted cane, trying to hear muffled instructions at check-in, struggling to maneuver into a narrow airplane seat while people grew impatient behind her. By lunchtime, her feet ached, her back throbbed, and frustration bubbled in her chest. At one point, she tried to ask a flight attendant for assistance, only to be dismissed with the same impatient tone she had once used on James. Humiliation burned through her. So this is what it felt like. By the end of the day, Tiffany slumped into a chair, exhausted and humbled, and waiting for her, sitting across the table with a knowing smile, James Whittaker. "So," he said, sipping his coffee, "did you learn something?" Tiffany stared at James, her face hot with shame. The weight of the day, both physically and emotionally, pressed on her, and for the first time, She truly understood how wrong she had been. She swallowed hard, looking down at her trembling hands. I owe you an apology, Mr. Whittaker. A real one. James set his coffee cup down, watching her intently. Go on. Tiffany took a deep breath. I treated you horribly. I was impatient, dismissive, and outright rude. I assumed things about you that weren't true, and I let my bad mood justify treating a passenger unfairly. She met his gaze, her voice quieter now. But today, I got to experience what it's like to be in your shoes, to feel ignored, frustrated, unimportant. James nodded slowly, but said nothing, allowing her words to settle. Tiffany clenched her hands together. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'll never treat another passenger that way again, especially not an elderly one. For a long moment, James remained silent. Then, to Tiffany's surprise, he chuckled. You remind me of myself when I was younger, he said. Arrogant, short-tempered, thought I had the world figured out. He leaned back in his chair, but life has a funny way of humbling people. Tiffany let out a shaky breath. I'd say it humbled me today. James nodded approvingly. Good. That means my lesson wasn't wasted. She hesitated before asking, why didn't you just have me fired? James smirked. Because punishment isn't always the best way to teach someone. I don't want to ruin your career, Tiffany. I just wanted you to understand. Tiffany felt a lump form in her throat. She had expected anger, revenge, or even smug satisfaction. But instead, James Whittaker had chosen to teach her, and that, she realized, was far more powerful. 3 months later, Tiffany stood at the gate, adjusting her uniform with newfound confidence. She had just completed an intensive customer service and sensitivity training program, one she had volunteered to extend beyond the required sessions. Now she was back on duty, boarding passengers with a warm smile and an entirely new mindset. As an elderly woman struggled with her carry-on, Tiffany rushed over without hesitation. Let me help you with that, ma'am, she said gently, lifting the bag and guiding the woman to her seat. Why, thank you, dear, the woman said, beaming. As Tiffany turned, she spotted a familiar face boarding the plane. James Whittaker. He walked slowly down the aisle, leaning on his cane, and met her gaze with a raised brow. Tiffany's heart pounded as she stepped forward. Mr. Whittaker. He gave her a knowing smile. Tiffany. I just wanted to say, thank you, she said earnestly, for giving me a chance to learn instead of just writing me off. James nodded, his eyes twinkling. Good to see you taking that lesson to heart. As he settled into his seat, Tiffany felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had been given a second chance, one she wouldn't waste. And this time, she was determined to treat every passenger with the kindness and respect they deserved. A year had passed since that fateful flight, but Tiffany still thought about it often. She had since become a different person, more patient, more understanding, and far more compassionate. The lessons she had learned from James Whittaker had changed her perspective on life, and she made it her mission to ensure no passenger ever felt the way he had on that day. One afternoon, she received an invitation from the airline's headquarters. Confused but curious, she attended the event and was stunned to see James Whittaker standing on the stage. The airline had arranged a special tribute to honor his lifetime of service, unveiling a newly named aircraft, the Whittaker Legacy. As the audience applauded, James caught Tiffany's eye and smiled. After the ceremony, she approached him, her voice filled with sincerity. Mr. Whittaker, I don't know if you remember me, but... He chuckled. Oh, I remember you, young lady. She swallowed, then continued. I just wanted to say, thank you. You changed my life that day. I'll never forget it. James patted her shoulder. That's all I ever wanted, to make a difference. Sounds like you're doing just that now. As Tiffany walked away, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had made mistakes, but she had also grown. And sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most powerful transformations.